I showed up to Christmas dinner with a broken arm. They all looked at me like it was an ornament gone wrong, surprised, a little inconvenienced. Kevin gave that half smile he reserves for awkward moments, and as if the whole room needed to be reassured there was nothing to see, said, "My wife taught her a lesson." He said it like a joke, like the sort of thing you say when you want everyone to laugh and move on. I sat there with my arm in a sling and the smell of cinnamon and roast in the air, and I laughed too, because the alternative was to say what I knew, that it wasn't a joke at all. It's strange how people will reach for simple answers when the real one is messy. They wanted the story to be small, a slip on the ice, an accident in the kitchen, because a small story lets us all be comfortable. I had a different story, and that night I could see the relief in their faces as they chose the easy version. That relief was how they told me what kind of danger I was in. People who brief over the truth make good accomplices. I'm Margaret Thompson. I'm a retired nurse, which means I learned early how to watch and to wait, how to read a bruise like a sentence and a pattern like a paragraph. My husband Frank built the coffee table we still have in the living room, thick oak, a corner softened by years of elbows and teacups. He died 2 years before I turned 67. He left a pile of memories and a garden box that never got weeded unless I had a mind to. When you spend 30 years of your life caring for someone, the silence that follows is a physical thing. It sits heavy on the chest. After Frank died, Kevin and his wife Brittany were around a lot. At first they were kind in the way people are kind when someone is grieving. Casseroles, phone calls, offers to take out the trash. Kevin's smile was practiced. Brittany's laugh came quickly and filled the spaces Frank used to, and I was grateful. Grief makes you accept help you might never have otherwise. It's not malicious. It's simply need. But there's a difference between help and takeover. The first time they suggested I sell the house, it was couched in concern. "You'll be safer," Kevin said. "You could have less to worry about." Brittany suggested an apartment that sounded delightful and had less upkeep. They painted the picture so brightly I could almost hear the ocean in it. The phrase they kept returning to was convenience. Convenience is a quiet word with a lot of teeth. I didn't want to sell. This house was Frank's and mine. I could still garden, write letters, read under the cotton throw we'd had since our 40s. But I'm not a stubborn fool. I told them I'd think about it. Then, within weeks, they were at my door with a stack of brochures and timelines and a notepad full of ways to make the transition easier. They brought up power of attorney like it was a formality, like it was paperwork that just made things simpler, signed and filed and never thought about again. Looking back, the pressure was gradual on purpose. They didn't barge in and demand my keys. They offered to do little things that made my life marginally easier. Pay a bill I'd misplaced, come over to fix a leaky faucet. Help can feel like a hand extended. It was only later that I realized how many fingers they had curled around my wrist. When they suggested that moving in would be temporary, I nearly believed them. I remember the day they brought boxes and moved my things into the room they called the guest craft room. They rearranged the furniture in the living room to make space for Brittany's projects. They put a TV in my bedroom for my convenience. The first week, they made soup, and they were attentive in that way people are when they are being watched. Kevin asked how I was sleeping. Brittany asked if the heat was comfortable. They were performers, smooth, considerate, obliging. The rules came soon after, small things at first. No dishes left overnight, no late guests, the thermostat set to a comfortable 71. If I wandered into the kitchen and wanted to put on music, I'd be told the neighbors complained. If I reached for the last cup of coffee, I was told to leave it for their schedule. They left sticky notes with instructions on the fridge and took to moving my reading glasses to their usual spots as if it were a kindness. Each action alone could have been shrugged off. Together, they made a web. The isolation built like fog. Friends stopped coming by because of the construction or because Brittany's schedule made things complicated. Phone calls from people I'd known for years were answered with a "she's resting" or "we'll get her later," and then never returned. Small humiliations became daily. Once, Kevin stood in the doorway of the bathroom and spoke to me as if I were a child while I was brushing my teeth. He asked where my pills were, then wrote it down in a ledger he kept tucked into a drawer. Brittany suggested I let them handle my finances for my peace of mind. Peace of mind, they said, like it was a product. I knew the signs. I'd read about elder exploitation in medical journals when I still worked. Post-retirement habit, keeping sharp. The pattern matched something I'd treated in the hospital a decade earlier. A gradual stripping away of autonomy until the patient felt complicit in their own erasure. The difference was that medical staff intervene. Family members rarely do that. Family smiles hide a lot. What tipped the scales wasn't a single violent moment. It was a phrase I overheard when I thought the door was closed. I was making tea in the kitchen, watching steam snake up from the pot, when I heard Kevin and Brittany talking in the living room. I meant to ignore them, but the words were clear through the wall. "Once we have the house sold," Brittany said, "we'll be able to put him on the policy. We can get the life insurance payout straight into our account. The paperwork will take care of the rest." I stood frozen, the kettle hissing. The words were ordinary enough. Insurance, sale, paperwork, until they weren't. They fit together into something that smelled like calculation. I had no right to leap to conclusions, and I tried not to. But the nurse in me started making a list. Motivations, opportunities, means. And the corner where Frank's coffee table stood felt suddenly too quiet. That evening, I pretended I hadn't heard. I kept my voice light. I asked about a recipe. I laughed at a joke. They thanked me for being so understanding. I let them, because assuming the ordinary is how conversation continues. But when I lay awake that night, counting that old habit of counting sheep out of the room, I made another list, this one private. If they were planning to gain financial control, they'd need legal standing, power of attorney. They'd need to cut off outside influence to keep people from asking the right questions. They were doing that already. They'd need documents. They had already been bringing burgers of paperwork into my house. They'd need me to appear compliant. I realized then that I had to treat my life like a case file. It sounds clinical, but when the stakes are your home and the dignity you built over decades, you get clinical. I was not going to be erased. I wrapped my broken arm carefully that winter. It had happened 2 weeks before that overheard conversation. No accident, not exactly. I'd been reaching for a dish in the sink when Brittany came in furious about something small I'd done. She brushed past me roughly. I lost my footing and hit the corner of the counter. I fell hard. After the fall, they were attentive. They rushed me to the ER and stayed. Kevin told the staff I'd tripped. Brittany hovered and said, "We're just glad she's okay." They made sure the discharge papers were signed. They brought me home with a homemade chicken soup and the softest blanket. Later, when the bruise healed and the swelling came down, Kevin's tone when he mentioned the incident was light. "She was a bit difficult yesterday, so my wife had to teach her a little lesson." The room laughed, and I laughed with them. But privately, I cataloged the impact. A small fracture that left my arm weak and my trust weaker. You have to forgive me if I sounded too calm about all of this. Calm is not the same as acceptance. Calm was strategy. I learned as a nurse that panic makes mistakes. Panic erases clarity. So I watched, and I waited, and I made a plan. The first practical thing I did was to call Dr. Jennifer Walsh. Dr. Walsh had been my primary care physician for years. She's practical and has an attention to detail that is almost surgical. Unlike Kevin and Brittany, she doesn't perform warmth. She is steady. I told her I was worried about some changes in my household dynamics and asked if she would do me a favor. If she ever received a message that suggested I needed a welfare check, would she please call the local non-emergency line and ask for one? It was a small request, a sort of password. and she agreed without hesitation. She listened and repeated back what I said, like a good clinician. If I receive anything odd, I'll call in and say we need a welfare check. Got it. Her voice was steady. I felt a small relief. Next, I rang Marcus Chen, an elder law attorney I'd been referred to through a friend of a friend. Marcus has a quiet way of making complicated things make sense. He explained the protections available for older adults without lecturing me. He told me what documents mattered: medical records, a current will, any recent changes to beneficiaries or policies, and how to keep copies in a safe place. He outlined, in plain language, how power of attorney works, how having everything scanned and time-stamped can be an advantage. He didn't promise miracles. He told me to be prepared. Documentation became my center. I started small. I kept a notebook in my bedside table where I wrote dates and short descriptions of incidents, arguments, things taken without asking, moments where I felt cornered. I started photographing bruises and cuts with my phone, then uploading those images to a cloud drive that I alone could access. I printed important bills, statements, and any paperwork that had Kevin or Brittany's names on it. I labeled everything and wrote a short note about where I found it. Nurses like boxes and labels. We like order in things that could otherwise look like chaos. I bought a pen recorder, sturdy, meant to be hidden among a jumble of pens, and a small, unobtrusive camera that could be placed in the oak bookshelf Frank made. I'm careful not to use dramatic words about these devices. They were tools. In my world, tools are how we get evidence into the light. I chose devices that uploaded automatically to the cloud, so that even if they found them, somewhere there would be copies. I tested them. One night, I sat in my quiet living room and recorded myself speaking the date, my name, and a note that the recording was for my files. I uploaded the audio and breathed, because the knowledge that a voice in my own house testified to what had happened felt like armor. Buying equipment feels like stepping across a line. You know morally what you are doing, but society keeps saying privacy is a right and spying is a sin. But there's a difference between prying and protecting. I was not trying to catch someone in a misstep. I was trying to make sure there was a record in case something worse happened. That distinction kept me steady. I told Dr. Walsh what I was doing in simple terms. She offered to write a letter noting my concerns, which would be useful if medical documentation was needed later. Marcus helped me draft instructions on what to do if I was physically harmed, or if they tried to switch my financial paperwork. He showed me how to make an evidence package, a timeline, physical documentation, a storage of uploaded materials, and a contact sheet of people who could be called in an emergency. He insisted gently that I keep a duplicate set of all documents outside the house in a safety deposit box. I did. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. At dinner, I smiled through the pressure and let them rearrange things, because outright confrontation would have made them defensive, and defensive people are dangerous. There was a particular cruelty in their kindness. They would make me a cup of tea, carefully, with a bloom of chamomile, and then insist I rest while they tidied up. They put notes on my clothes, suggesting what would look nice and which shoes would be easier to wear. They laughed at things that were not jokes. One afternoon, I was folding linens when I found, tucked into a stack of mail Kevin had helpfully sorted, a document from an insurance company. It was a policy with Frank's name on it. The beneficiary had been changed a year after his death. The change was signed. The signature looked unfamiliar. On the form, the new beneficiary was listed in a way that made my stomach drop. I didn't know enough to jump to conclusions. Paper can be messy, but my hands trembled as I copied the policy number and photographed the page. The nurse in me couldn't let an oddity go undocumented. I started listening more closely. I learned the cadence of Kevin's voice when he was lying. There's a stiffness to it, the same way a vein stands out under the skin when someone is trying to force cheerfulness. Brittany's anger was thinly varnished with sweetness, and it would crack when she thought no one was looking. They were good at rehearsed compassion. They were even better at making the story of help seem non-threatening. At night, I would sit in the living room and talk to Frank's photographs. It sounds like a romanticism, but talking it out helped me parse what was true. The house had been built by hands I loved, the fence put up in a summer when my knees could still dig into the dirt. Each corner held a memory that was worth preserving. Losing the house wasn't just losing a roof. It was losing a chronology of a life. There were moments I questioned whether I was making too much of it. I was tired. I'd had a fracture and the shoulder ached on wet days. Sometimes it's easier to imagine conspiracies than to accept boredom. But the pile of small incidents, bruises, invoices moved, calls ignored, built into a structure that said one thing: this was not care, this was control. One day, I listened from the hallway as Kevin spoke to a man on the phone whose name I didn't recognize. He said something about moving things along and clearing obstacles, and used the word expedite. My hands gripped the banister so tightly I left marks. I did not go in and demand to know who he was calling. Instead, I opened the notebook and wrote down the time. The most dangerous part of being elderly in someone else's hands is that your concerns are often dismissed as confusion. So I made sure everything I did could be verified. I made my notes neat. I dated every photograph and used the cloud's timestamps as a backup. I made it hard for them to gaslight me with excuses. They began to notice that I was more private. Brittany asked one evening as she salted the soup why I had closed my laptop earlier. "Did you find anything?" she teased, and the laugh was thin. I answered that I was just keeping records of my medical appointments. It was true, but it was small, and it hid what I was really doing. If they suspected, they didn't say. There were times I felt very small. Once I stood in the kitchen with my arms weak from the fracture, and Brittany stood close enough that her perfume filled my nose. She told me to smile more, to appear less hollow for the family. A week later, Kevin rearranged my mail again without asking. The triviality of it is what made it so sharp. They were trying to take the shape of my days. I made a list of allies beyond Dr. Walsh and Marcus. Mrs. Peterson, my next-door neighbor, had always been a coffee morning friend. She brought over lemon loaf and asked how I was doing. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough to make sure someone knew I might need help. Linda, my sister, lived 2 hours away but called every Sunday. I kept those calls regular and used them as a lifeline, a way of saying, "I'm still here." When not, these relationships became part of my evidence strategy, people who could corroborate if something happened. The day I finally hid the recorder in the living room bookshelf was the day I felt both terrified and oddly steady. I placed the pen recorder behind a row of old medical textbooks Frank had on the shelf. I set the camera into a small crevice where the eye barely peeked through the wood grain. I whispered into the recorder, date, time, "This is Margaret Thompson," recording from my files. And then I left the room and went about the act of making tea like any other afternoon. I could hear the quiet of my own breath. I thought of all the nurses who had taught me how to document wounds, the angle of a bruise, the way a person describes pain, the difference between a limp and a favoring gait. I used the same method to turn my life into a folder that could be opened and read by someone who had not been watching me vanish. I was not preparing an accusation. I was creating a mirror. When someone denies your reality, a mirror is what you need. Putting the devices in place felt like a covenant with myself. If nothing came of it, then at least I had made the effort to be seen. If something did come of it, then those recordings would be what made it possible to prove what had been whispered in corners. I tested the cloud backup on a rainy Tuesday. The audio file uploaded, the time stamped, the little green icon telling me there was a copy somewhere else. The sensation was almost physical, relief that something outside of my house could hold the evidence should it be needed. Marcus had explained that redundancy is important. "You don't put all your eggs in one basket," he'd said. He was right. I duplicated everything to a safe deposit box and sent a copy, encrypted to an email only I could access. I want to be very clear here. I did not take these steps because I was paranoid. I took them because I knew the patterns. There are people who exploit older adults not because they are cruel for the sake of cruelty, but because there is opportunity. Opportunity has a way of breeding boldness in people who believe no one will challenge them. Over the next few weeks, my life became a quiet exercise in observation. I kept up my mornings with the kettle and the radio. I went to my physical therapy appointments for the arm. I walked the block with Mrs. Peterson when the weather allowed. I made sure to be seen in small ways that weren't conspicuous, and I recorded. Sometimes I listened to the recordings and felt sick to my stomach. Other times I felt a fierce kind of gratitude that the devices were catching what my eyes could not. One clip captured a meeting in the living room where Kevin quietly suggested that the house would be easier to manage if they had legal control. Brittany added, so casually it might have been a joke, "We could get everything sorted faster if we had authority." Their voices were recorded like two people planning a kitchen renovation. They sounded normal. That audacity is what makes such things possible. A small victory that mattered more than it should. Marcus helped me file a notarized statement indicating that I had not recently signed any document changing beneficiaries, and that unless shown otherwise, my current preferences stood. It was a small legal hurdle, but it bought me time. Time felt like a currency I could exchange for safety. And still, the emotional part was the hardest. I had to pretend to be blind to some things in order to gather the full picture. I had to answer phones and laugh sometimes when a joke was made about how slow old people are. I swallowed the sting every time Kevin used the phrase, "for your own good," and then slipped another item of control across the table. I watched how they rearranged my world and cataloged it like a nurse who takes a history, methodically, clinically, with the intention that these notes would matter later. There were nights when the fear woke me. The house felt too large, with winter tightening its hands around the eaves. I would stand at the window and look at the neighbors' houses sleeping under snow and think about what it would take to be invisible and what it would take to be believed. Then I would take out the little notebook and make a line, date, time, short sentence. Even when my hands were too tired to write neatly, I wrote. Small, legible records. They were my protest against erasure. I am telling you this because the start of the story is not the dramatic confrontation you imagine. It is a series of ordinary things made sharp. It is the way a slow pressure becomes unbearable when you look back on it in the right light. It is a lesson about how abuse can dress itself as care and be applauded for it. One afternoon, a month after I began recording, I overheard something that made me tighten my grip on the kettle. Kevin was on the phone in the kitchen, but his voice wasn't muffled. It filled the house. He said someone had taken care of an obstacle from a previous property sale. He used the word later several times. He talked about speeding things up. I stood still and traced the exact moment. If you want to piece together a story later, you must have the precise coordinates, the time, the place, the people. This one clip would later be important, but at the time it was only another worry stored in the cloud. My arm was still healing. The sling made even small tasks take more time. I learned how to tape my notebooks to the table when I needed to write with one hand. My independence felt narrow and precious. I learned to accept practical help from Mrs. Peterson and Linda, and to refuse it with others. Choosing who aided me became a deliberate act. If I had to give advice to someone listening to this now, it would be to make allies quietly and early. Do not assume the people closest to you are your safest harbor. Get your doctor and an attorney to know what you suspect. Keep copies of important documents. Back up photographs and messages. The things that feel small, an email, a dated photo, are often the pieces that prove a story that otherwise can be smoothed over with charm. There is a cruelty I want to name because I think it surprised me. The way kindness from the people who hurt you is used as proof of their innocence. When Kevin took a load of old blankets to the shelter, visitors nodded and said, "He's such a good son." When Brittany apologized for being overprotective, they forgave her. I forgave her in public to keep the peace. Forgiveness can be a strategy too. Sometimes you use it to get through dinner. On a Tuesday in late November, I sat at the kitchen table and uploaded another set of files. My heart raced while the little bars filled. I felt like a bridge-building person, someone making a crossing from doubt to clarity. The cloud dinged when the files were secure. I exhaled. The sound in the house was the hum of the refrigerator, and somewhere in the other room, the television playing an old sitcom laugh track. It all felt absurd and mundane, and that juxtaposition is what kept me moving forward. That night, I wrote a note to myself. If confronted, send password red maple to Dr. Walsh. She will request a welfare check immediately. It felt theatrical to set a password phrase, but Marcus had recommended it because we needed a way to make sure any call from my doctor would be taken seriously by dispatchers. Simple protocols removed the room for hesitation in an emergency. I had not told Kevin or Brittany about the arrangements with Dr. Walsh or Marcus. I planned to keep it that way unless it was needed. There is power in keeping your safety plan private. There were moments of ridiculous tenderness, too. Once, Brittany made lemon bars that were not bad. Kevin would sometimes clear leaves from the driveway without being asked. Mrs. Peterson baked an apple pie that warmed the house with spice. Linda called me and told me about a rose bush she'd planted in her backyard. Those moments were not lies. They were genuine warmth that served to confuse the pattern. Abuse is not a single color. It's a complex palette. Recognizing that complexity is hard because it means that loved ones can be both good and dangerous. As the weeks pressed on, the pattern tightened. They began attending more of my appointments, speaking for me during the examinations. Kevin would chip in on the phone with social services in a way that made the nurse I was in younger times cringe. "She's overwhelmed," he'd tell them. I sat politely in the room while someone else described how I felt, and I did not correct every misstatement. Sometimes the correction would make them defensive, and I needed them to be unaware. I became a collector of mundane evidence, photos, emails, receipts, each a small shard that could one day fit into something larger. I kept the notebook updated. When something hurt or seemed wrong, I wrote it down immediately. Barring anyone else, I had to be my own witness. Then came the day when I decided it was time to make the plan more active. For months, I had been passive-aggressive in my protection, documenting, backing up, making secret copies. But passive measures have limits. I needed a way to have help in the house without tipping my hand. I needed the paperwork and friends and a fail-safe that didn't rely on luck. I revised the plan with Marcus and Dr. Walsh over a lunch where I could watch the clock and measure the cadence of my words. Marcus suggested a 3-step activation: a coded message to Dr. Walsh, who would then contact dispatch, and a simultaneous call to the police non-emergency line if needed. He wrote out the steps in bullet points and underlined the timings. Doctor. Walsh explained what the welfare check would look like. Dispatch would send officers. They'd do an initial assessment, and if there were signs of immediate harm, they'd call for medical assistance. Marcus emphasized the importance of medical documentation, photos upon arrival, detailed records from the ER, and the timely collection of any notes that could corroborate an assault. We practiced the wording for the message. It felt strange rehearsing what would be asked in a moment of crisis, but rehearsal is what keeps you from freezing. I told Dr. Walsh that if she ever received red maple, she would call the police and say, "We need a welfare check at Margaret Thompson's home. Her health and safety are in question." Dr. Walsh repeated it back, and we all nodded. Marcus told me to add a routine language to the end of the message that would signal urgent medical attention needed. We agreed on small details that would, if needed, feel absurd to explain later, but would create a clear record if the system had to move. There is an irony I cannot help but point out. I had spent my life caring for other people's bodies in orderly rooms under fluorescent lights, and now I had to design a cheat sheet for my own survival. It felt unnerving and empowering at the same time. I tucked the activation wording into my wallet and into a hidden pocket of a cardigan that Kevin would never think to check. I copied the steps into the notebook and sealed the page with a scrap of tape. It felt paranoid, but in that moment, paranoia was method. 3 nights after we finalized the plan, I heard raised voices in the living room. I was on the sofa with my arm propped on a pillow, pretending to read. Kevin's voice was tight. Brittany's had that low, brittle edge. I couldn't make out every word through the wall, but I heard snippets about speeding up and getting everything in order. That was when I made the decision irrevocable. I would not wait for something terrible to happen. I would collect more than notes. I would collect the kind of proof that a court and a police officer could look at and not say, "Well, that's regrettable." I wanted statements that would not be dismissed as confusion or senility. I tucked my recorder under the cushion where I sat and set the camera, so the bookshelf's angle showed the corner of the living room where they often met. I felt foolish and cunning all at once. Then I sat very still and listened. 3 months later, the real reason became clear. 3 months later, the real reason became clear. It started with a small, stupid gesture that I should have expected. Brittany was rearranging the shelf for something she said was, for the better display. She pulled out a row of old books and hummed while she did it. I watched her from the sofa, my arm wrapped in its sling like a pale flag. I told myself I was being petty as she reached into the gap where I'd tucked the little pen recorder and the camera behind Frank's worn cardiology textbooks. She laughed at something Kevin said, and then the laugh stopped as she felt plastic under her fingertips. Her face shifted, surprise, then calculation, the way a person's jaw moves when they put on a mask. I remember the sound the recorder made when she slammed it on the coffee table as if it were a slap. My heart kicked. She said with that bright, practiced voice that always reminded me of canned peaches, "What on earth is this?" Kevin looked over like someone caught in a rainstorm without an umbrella. Brittany opened the case, and the tiny camera stared back like an accusing eye. They looked at me as if I'd been caught doing something shameful. The room, which had been patient and indulgent for so long, inhaled. I did not scream. I had rehearsed this in my head more times than the Christmas carols we used to sing with Frank. I kept my voice steady. I did what nurses are trained to do in a crisis. Breathe, prioritize, call for help in the clearest way you can, and make sure the facts are recorded. My hands shook when I reached for my phone and typed the words I'd practiced into Dr. Walsh's contact. Red maple. The moment the message left my phone, I felt a terrible release, as if I had dropped a stone into very still water. It was a small, absurdly bureaucratic thing to do in the middle of a living room where the person you loved was standing over you and telling you you were inventing trouble. But red maple was the hinge that would swing a lot of doors open. Marcus had made me promise I wouldn't hesitate. Dr. Walsh had promised she would not. Brittany didn't wait for me to be foolish. She lunged as if she were tugging a blanket and not a paper-thin life. She grabbed my arm, the one that was not in a sling, and shoved. I stumbled against the low table Frank had built. Her fingers twisted like a tool. I felt a blow across my cheek so quick I barely registered it until the taste was copper on my tongue. Kevin stepped forward, hands raised, saying something about calming down. His voice was precisely the one people use when they want to appear reasonable and make a bad act look accidental. Brittany's eyes were flat. I had seen flat inside hospital rooms, and it always preceded a bad diagnosis. I do not dwell on the blows. That is not because they were small. Some of them left marks, some left barely more than a memory, but because my mind had been occupied by other things that mattered more. The fact that the devices had been found, the fact that I had just sent a text that would bring help. I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt clinical, that if this escalated further, I wanted witnesses whose names would not be whispered away later. The house smelled of lemon from the cleaner Kevin had used earlier. The recorder lay open, its little red light like an injured eye. Brittany snatched it into her hand as if she thought destroying it would erase everything. She looked at the camera too, and then at the bookshelf, then at me, and laughed with a sound that was not amused. "You think you're clever," she said. Her voice had a brittle sweetness. Watching us like that, the gall of it, the insistence that I was the transgressor, made something low and resolute click into place inside me. I reached for my phone with the one hand that was steady and hit send on a second message. Marcus had told me to call him if anything happened, even if only to tell him the welfare check was underway. I called him, and he picked up within minutes. I cannot overstate how quickly Dr. Walsh moved. The phone rang, and then a voice I trusted said exactly what Marcus and I had rehearsed. "Dispatch, this is Dr. Jennifer Walsh calling. I need a welfare check at 14 Maple Lane. The patient is Margaret Thompson. I have reason to believe she may have been assaulted. Please send officers immediately." The words landed in the room like an instruction manual for action. Hearing that voice on the line made Kevin's confident posture wobble. The officers arrived faster than I expected. I later learned their names. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Chen were the first to step through the doorway with a steady, professional manner. They had the calm, practical way of people who know how to manage disorder without making spectacle of it. They asked to speak to me in the living room and had a notepad and a radio clipped to their vests. They asked questions I had already anticipated. Did I want medical assistance? Where was the pain? Could I describe what happened? I told them what had occurred, and I showed them the recorder open on the coffee table and the camera where it had been half covered by a dust jacket. Paramedics arrived, too. Officer Williams came with the ambulance team, and he moved with that double patience and speed that makes painful things tolerable. A young EMT took my vitals and wrote them down methodically, his gloved fingers gentle on my wrist. They photographed the bruises and abrasion, not in a prying way, but in the way of professionals making sure that what had been done to me had a record. In the ER later, photos would be taken with the same steady hands and cataloged into my file. The small, precise way they documented everything made me feel like a thing of value rather than a complication. Kevin tried to talk his way out. He said something about me overreacting, something about how the devices were invasive, but the audio file on the recorder told a different part of the story. The officers listened to a small snippet they could play on a station laptop. Hearing the recording was like opening a window. The sound of their own voices planning and negotiating filled the room. The officers exchanged a look. Detective Morrison's name came into play soon after. He was assigned to review the file and to coordinate with the prosecutor. When he later sat across from me in an interview room, he would tell me the little things that made him take the case seriously. The recordings, the timely medical documentation, and the bank records Marcus had flagged. At the scene, the police executed a search of common areas. They took the devices carefully, logging them, putting them into sealed evidence bags. They wrote down serial numbers and catalog stamps. I watched them do it with an odd sense of relief. Something about seeing the chain of custody form being filled out told me the story I had been trying to build would not disappear into a drawer. They also noted a handful of documents Kyle had kept in a leather folder on the dining table, bank statements, and an insurance letter. At that point, I did not know enough to understand the significance, but I trusted the officers who did. As the ambulance took me to the ER, Kevin protested, trying to control the narrative. He wanted to make it look like this was all an overreaction. Brittany stayed inside, arms folded, a coiled thing of brimstone and perfume. The neighborhood watched. Mrs. Peterson stood at her window with a hand to her mouth. Neighbors came out, a ripple of concern passing like a tide. Being watched is both humiliating and protective. In the ER, I answered questions. I described the sequence of events. I showed the injuries, and I let the doctors and nurses document. Dr. Walsh arrived within the hour and stood next to me like a referee who decided the match was not going to be fought unfairly. The medical record was precise. Photos, descriptions in medical terms, measurements. They made notes about bruises consistent with grabbing and twisting, about swelling in places where a hand had been placed. The nurse who took my history used language that later the prosecutor leaned on: the pattern of escalation, the presence of earlier injuries recorded by my own photographs, a fractured trust evidenced in small quotidian ways. Marcus arranged for copies of the records to be added to the evidence package. He told me later, with that firm clarity I'd come to rely on, that medical documentation is something judges and juries understand. When medicine writes down what the body shows, the thing becomes less subjective. Detective Morrison interviewed me for an hour in a small room lined with posters about community resources. He asked about timelines, about who had access to my mail, about any recent changes in my financial arrangements. I told him everything I'd written in my notebook: dates, times, the words I'd overheard about insurance and beneficiaries. He nodded, asked follow-up questions, and at one point said, in a voice I felt could be trusted, "We're going to look at their bank records and their communications. We'll see where the money's been moving." I believed him. I needed to. The arrest did not come at once. The police needed to process the scene, to check the cloud backups we had, to take statements, and then to obtain warrants. But within 24 hours, both Kevin and Brittany were brought in for questioning. Kevin, in particular, had been contacting friends and family, trying to spin a story about a misunderstanding. It was too late for that. The recordings had captured more than a few offhand remarks that now sounded chilling. References to clearing obstacles, to changing beneficiaries, to getting everything into our name quickly. Those phrases, taken alone, could be shrugged as mundane. Taken together, with the record of the assault and the change of beneficiary forms we had found, the prosecutor saw a pattern. I remember sitting in the detective's office while they explained what they had found in neat, legal phrases. They had pulled bank statements and found transfers that did not match typical household expenses. They'd found documents, some signed, some allegedly altered, that suggested changes in beneficiaries on a policy. Detective Morrison told me that because something about those documents looked inconsistent, the prosecutor was pursuing more than just the assault. He used the word indefinite, where something was not yet fully established. There were suspicions about prior incidents connected to insurance payouts, and he said the county medical examiner had been asked to assist. When he used the word exhumation, I felt a needle of cold move through me. The detective carefully framed it as an investigatory step, something done to test a hypothesis, not a final verdict. He said, "If we proceed carefully." Marcus became the steward of my anger in courtrooms and lawyers' offices. He arranged for restraining orders and for a temporary conservatorship to prevent any immediate transfers of assets. That last part hurt in a bureaucratic way. The paperwork itself seemed to put me in the role of someone whose competence might be questioned, and yet I knew it was a necessary shield against those who would empty out accounts while I tried to breathe. Marcus called it protective measures. He told me more than once, in that soft legal voice of his, that the law does not move like a tidal wave. It moves like a series of small, patient tides, each finding purchase. When charges were filed, the prosecutor outlined what they believed had been in motion: assault, elder exploitation, conspiracy to commit financial fraud. Those were the terms that were used in indictments. Later, as the investigation widened, additional allegations were added. Murder-related charges after the exhumation returned, results the medical examiner had described as inconsistent with the original death certificate. Words that had been uttered by a forensic pathologist and then repeated carefully in court documents. I was not privy to everything the state had gathered, but Detective Morrison would sit across from me again and say, "The evidence points to more than just this house. We're seeing a pattern. Life insurance changes, odd transfers, deaths that now read differently through a forensic lens." He did not speculate on motive beyond what the records showed. Marcus warned me not to let my imagination outrun the evidence. I tried to stay in the lane of what had been proven. Court hearings were a fog of suits and whispered strategy. The first time I sat in the gallery with Dr. Walsh and Mrs. Peterson and Linda in the pews behind me, I felt both exposed and anchored. The press tried to make sense of the story in a morning segment one week. The anchor asked me to describe how it felt to be betrayed by your own child. I tried to explain the complexity of love and fear without making it look like heroics. I told the reporter the truth. Betrayal by family feels like losing a map you didn't know you had. The clip grew legs in the early days, and people I had not met reached out with offers of coffee and help. And even a woman who'd been through something similar sent me an email that said simply, "I see you." The defense tried to discredit the recordings. There were motions about chain of custody, about admissibility. Marcus and the prosecutor answered with the paper trail I had been obsessive about creating. Timestamps in the cloud, duplicates in a safe deposit box, testimonies from the IT specialist who had verified the backups. The meticulous, unglamorous work I had done, dating photographs, copying invoices, asking Dr. Walsh to write down a note about my concerns, paid a legal dividend in ways I had hoped but not been able to predict. There was a hearing where the prosecutor walked the court through the audio clip where Kevin and Brittany discussed the insurance policy. They played it, and the sound of their voices in a room that was not trying to court mercy landed like evidence. The judge paused, listened, and then asked for more documentation about the policy changes. The insurance company cooperated, and Marcus obtained certified copies of the beneficiary designation and the amendments. The signature on one change did not match Frank's known handwriting. The company's records showed a signature date that post-dated an event it should not have, and the chain of paperwork made people who make a living reading documents sit up straight. Then came the exhumation. I remember the day as a sequence of small, shameful betrayals of my own routine. They sent a letter. They told me what would happen and how long it would take. A team of coroners and forensics came with a careful, almost private manner to where Frank had been buried. I watched from a distance as men in gloves worked with the mechanical precision of those who have made this their life's work. Detective Morrison came and stood beside me by the edge of the grounds and said, in the lowest of voices, "We're looking for anything that suggests the cause of death was not what the certificate says." I felt the ground give beneath me in a way that was not simply physical. The results, when they came, were clinical and devastating. The medical examiner's report noted findings inconsistent with the original death certificate. There were anomalies that prompted charges beyond elder financial exploitation. When the prosecutor announced that the case was being expanded to include homicide-related counts for the death of Frank, the room hummed with a sound that could be described as both validation and renewed grief. It's one thing to get a legal victory. It's another to have the name of your grief taken and turned into a legal category. I felt the strange mix of vindication and hollow pain that comes when a loss is re-examined through instruments and evidence. The detective had warned me that legal recognition of wrongdoing would not bring Frank back, and he was right in the most brutal way. Both Kevin and Brittany were indicted on the expanded set of charges. The arraignments were surreal. Watching your son in handcuffs was a tearing, private kind of sadness. He did not look like the boy who had learned to hammer a nail with Frank. He looked thin and angry and small in the fluorescent light. Brittany maintained a posture of disdain that sometimes cracked into quiet pleading. The community divided in quiet ways. Some refused to believe what the state alleged. Others felt vindicated in a wariness that had always sat like a shadow behind polite conversations. The case did not go straight to trial. Plea negotiations began. Prosecutors told me that plea bargains are how many cases reach resolution in our courts. Years of expense and testimony can be compressed into a negotiated admission that spares a jury's ordeal. That sounded mercenary to the part of me that wanted a full public airing. Marcus explained the calculus: certainty of accountability versus the risk of acquittal at trial. I had to decide, in a council of people I trusted, how I wanted to see this end. In the end, both Kevin and Brittany accepted plea offers that included admissions to several counts. The court accepted the pleas, and after a present-tense report, imposed sentences that Marcus told me were substantial. I did not watch the sentencing as if it were a movie. I watched it through the gauze of a body that had been bent and aired and wound anew. Even as the legal decisions unfolded, the personal work of reclaiming my home and life began. The restraining orders kept them away. The locks were changed. I sat on the front stoop with Mrs. Peterson and Linda and cried, and they baked lemon bars and planted a little rose bush in the corner of the yard in Frank's memory. Marcus helped me clear liens and deal with the bank, who had seen odd transfers, but was, mercifully, cooperative when presented with the court orders and the evidence. There was a quiet day when I opened the front door and let sunlight come into rooms that had felt watched for too long. I went to therapy. I joined a survivor group that met at the library and listened to other people tell their stories in halting, precise sentences. It was strange and ordinary to hear that loneliness and fear make a kind of grammar you can learn to speak. The women in the group were fierce in their gentleness. They taught me that grief doesn't become less intense. It becomes a different shape you learn to live inside. There were interviews. A local reporter came and asked if I would talk about elder exploitation. I hesitated. I had been private for months, and then publicity knocked like an honest but insistent neighbor. I agreed, because I knew the story had the power to be preventative for someone else. On the night of the broadcast, I sat with Frank's picture next to the lamp and spoke about documentation, about the importance of a trusted physician and an elder law attorney, about keeping copies of crucial papers. I told the reporter that the smallest things, a dated email, a photograph, a note, are sometimes the things that turn suspicion into proof. The community responded in ways that were tender. Strangers donated time to help fix my fence. A local woodworking group offered to repair the corner of Frank's coffee table, where years of elbows had softened the oak. People came to sit with me and talk. I found that kindness, when offered simply, was a balm. There was also a public reckoning of sorts. When the prosecution released a statement about the investigation's broader implications, they used clinical words like pattern and financial motive. Detective Morrison was careful to stress that investigations like this require patience and proof, but he also said that our case had encouraged more neighbors to come forward with concerns. That was one of the strangest comforts, that my insistence that the house be seen had helped others unclench and ask questions about their own families. Justice did not feel like a thunderclap. It felt like a series of small doors opening, restraints put in place, court records updated, people I trusted standing with me in public. Even in the finality of a plea, there were mixed emotions: rage at the betrayal, sorrow for the wasted kinship I had hoped would ride the rest of my days, and a steady, stubborn gratitude that the small plan I had made in a room of winter had been enough to call the law's attention. Months after the sentencing, I reclaimed the parts of my life that were salvageable and reshaped others. I took a trip I had promised myself if I ever felt the courage to step away from the house that had become contested ground. A Mediterranean cruise felt extravagant and sanctifying. I wanted the salt wind on my face, the sound of other languages, the small anonymity of walking along unfamiliar cobbles. Linda came with me. Mrs. Peterson watered the roses while we were gone. I will not paint the trip as a pilgrimage, but as we watched the sun fold into the sea, I felt permission to be alive in ways grief had not allowed. I returned and started volunteering at the Elder Center downtown. There is something consoling about showing up and seeing how ordinary help can be. I taught a small class on making notebooks, how to date entries, how to keep medical information organized, how to store backups. People laughed when I told them about the pen recorder hidden behind cardiology textbooks. Some thought the idea mischievous, others profound. They asked practical questions: how to talk to a doctor, how to find an elder law attorney, how to speak to a neighbor. I answered with what I had learned. allies matter, paperwork matters. The kindness of a nearby person can be a lifeline. My relationship with Kevin is complicated in ways that have no neat moral resolution. I do not visit him. I do not write angry manifestos on his character. I acknowledge the grief for what he might have been, and I accept the reality of what he did. In court, I read a victim impact statement that was honest and limited. I spoke not only about the harm, but also about the complicated love that exists, even when trust is broken beyond repair. The sentence gave a measure of societal condemnation. It did not undo the betrayal. That must be held as an honest fact, rather than a moral failing I can amend with prayer or patience. There were small joys that crept back in. The sound of neighbors talking on Saturday mornings in the way that had always warmed me, the smell of Mrs. Peterson's pies, the way the afternoon light hit Frank's coffee table and turned it a honeyed color. I planted a new set of tomatoes, not the box he used to prefer, but a smaller, sweeter variety. I found myself laughing at something on television, and then feeling guilty for laughing, and then deciding guilt is an old coat I no longer need to wear every day. People sometimes ask whether I forgave Kevin. I have learned to answer with nuance. Forgiveness, in my case, has not been a tidy absolution. It is a choice I make about how I carry the memory of what happened. On some mornings, I choose compassion because the world is better when we try to hold complexity. People can do damaging things and also have been shaped into those acts by anger, fear, and choices we may never understand. On other mornings, I remind myself of the very practical lessons I learned, that you must protect your legal and physical autonomy with the same tenderness you use to water plants. I have been asked to speak to community groups and in legal seminars about elder exploitation. I do it because there is value in translating the arc of my experience into something predictive for others. The signs to watch, the questions to ask, the small archives to keep. Marcus sometimes sits in the back of a room and listens as I describe why the cloud backup saved months of whispered evidence from being lost. Doctor. Walsh and I have done podcast interviews where she explains what medical professionals can do to help older adults who suspect exploitation. The work of public education feels like an extension of Frank's habit of building things, one small structure of safety at a time. One of the darkest ironies of the whole experience is the way Kevin framed the assault at that first Christmas. My wife taught her a lesson, as if violence were a corrective measure. That phrase has stuck like a burr in my memory. I use it now when I speak in public, sometimes quoting it to show how violence is minimized when cloaked in domestic language. The sentence used to make me feel small. Now it functions like a boundary marker. Look at the arrogance it takes to call abuse a lesson. The house feels like the finest, most complicated artifact of my life. Reclaiming it was not simply about the roof and the garden. It was about the chronology of a life I had built with Frank, and about a set of ordinary objects, books, dishes, the coffee table, that held the narrative of decades of daily commitments. Rebooting the candor and joy in that space took time. I painted a wall a color Frank would have laughed at, smaller, fiercer choices that felt like reclamation. I kept a copy of each court document in a drawer, as a reminder that the paper was proof that I had been believed. Sometimes, at night, I sit by the lamp where Frank's photograph looks back at me and think about the weird moral arithmetic of justice. The law did what it could with the evidence available. It sentenced. It published documents. It made a public accounting. But the interior work, the remaking of trust, the learning to live with the shape of a home after betrayal, was mine. I tried to do that work with the same discipline I had used in nursing. Observe, document, tend, and keep showing up. There remains occasionally a flash of anger, raw and bright. Not every day closes neatly. There are times when I hear a suggestion on the radio about family disputes and my chest tightens. But increasingly those moments are followed by a different, quieter emotion, a recognition that the planning I did saved me from becoming erased. That realization moves through me like a warm current. It is both practical pride, because the devices worked, because the allies responded, and a softer humility about how ordinary decisions can accumulate into life-saving outcomes. I now spend some afternoons working on an article for the Elder Center newsletter about the specifics of documentation, how to photograph injuries, how to keep a dated notebook, and how to create a safety envelope with copies of wills, policies, and contact numbers. Marcus and Dr. Walsh have fact-checked the piece, and their approval means more to me than any byline. My little class at the center has become a meeting place where strangers swap resources and phone numbers like seeds. We bank the small kindnesses, and they grow. There were, of course, nights when I wanted to blame the whole world, and not just those who betrayed me. Those nights felt like the old winter, when the house echoed with the big silence of losing Frank. But the practical acts, the new lock, the rose bush, the safe deposit box, acted like stitches. Life continued with the oddity of normal days, threaded through a changed interior landscape. I allowed myself small immoralities of joy, an impulse buy of a scarf in a color I'd never worn, a cake from the bakery down the street, a long call with a woman from the Survivor group about nothing at all. Once, while I was on the porch drinking morning tea, Mrs. Peterson came by with a small, inflammable joy, a cupcake and a photocopy of a newspaper clipping she had kept from our case. She sat with me, and we looked at the headline and then at Frank's photograph. We didn't have to talk about everything. Sometimes simply sitting beside someone who knows the shape of your days is a kind of repair. The legal documents are now a part of my life in a very literal sense. They exist in folders, in PDF files, and in printouts that remind me how fragile rights can be when they are not actively guarded. I keep them because they are proof, and I keep them because they remind me of the people who helped me translate my suspicion into law. People ask whether I'm angry. I am, on some days, like anyone else who has been wronged. But anger has given way to a fiercer, steadier thing: resolve. I resolved that my late life would not be written for me by the most selfish people I had encountered. I would write my days in the small, practical ways I knew how, by making lists, going to appointments, visiting friends, and teaching others what I had learned. There is a hunger in me to be useful now in a different way. I have found that elsewhere, in the group classes, in the calls with people who ask for advice, in the notes from strangers who say, "Because of what you shared, I checked on my aunt." The final quiet lesson that sits with me is this: sometimes survival looks like paperwork. Sometimes it looks like a coded message to a trusted doctor. Sometimes it looks like planting a rose bush. Survival is not heroic in a single magazine-ready moment. It is the accumulation of ordinary decisions that, in aggregate, become something like resilience. When I think back to that Christmas dinner, I remember the way Kevin said, "My wife taught her a lesson," as if violence could be massaged into propriety by a well-timed joke. I remember sitting there with my arm in a sling and the smell of roast and cinnamon in the air, and how my laughter that night was a small, defiant thing. It could have been a last laugh if I had allowed it to be the end of everything. Instead, it became the beginning of a quieter, firmer narrative. If there is one piece of practical advice I give to anyone listening, it is this: make your life legible. Keep dates, make copies, find allies before you need them, and believe your own assessment of what is happening in your home. There is no single step that guarantees safety, but the habit of documentation and the practice of gathering witnesses are gifts that keep on giving. I am still Margaret Thompson. I still prune the rosebush in spring and sit with Frank's photograph and tell him, sometimes, about the little ordinary things that have returned, how the table gleams in the afternoon light, how the kettle whistles just so. I am also a woman who learned, in a season of winter in courthouse rooms, how to name and gather evidence, how to ask for help, and how to let the law do the heavy, exacting work that it can do. I have no illusions that every story ends like mine did. The courts are imperfect and outcomes vary. All I can say is what worked for me. Document, make allies, have a plan, and keep copies in more than one place. And when possible, tell someone you trust what you suspect. The small acts of preparation that felt foolish at the time were the very things that made it possible for me to sit, years later, on my porch with the sun warming the oak, and to feel the rightness of having chosen life. The city paper ran a profile after the trial. They put my photograph next to a headline about elder exploitation. I read it with a sober attention to the fact that the story itself had become a tool. People shared it with relatives and friends. Sometimes the phone rang with polite panic, neighbors asking what to do. I gave them names, Dr. Walsh, Marcus Chen, and the number for the senior center. Those small referrals, I thought, were the ripples I had made when I refused to look away. When I look at the coffee table Frank built, I see the marks of our years and the places where we rested our elbows. I see the small scuffs where life happened, and I see the space where resilience lives now. Once, Kevin's voice, that practiced smile bright as a brittle coin, had tried to make my pain into a punchline. The memory of that sentence is a sharp thing, but so is the fact that the law listened. That listening was not simple vindication. It was a complicated hand lent in a very practical way. There are mornings when I wake and the house is just as it has always been, an archive of small decisions and enduring love. Other mornings I wake and remember the peculiar violence of betrayal. Both are true. I carry them both, and I use them. I have been asked, in interviews and in whispered conversations, what I learned most. I tell them I learned to trust my own observations and to create a paper trail for the life you will not allow others to erase. I tell them that allies matter. The doctor who will call dispatch, the attorney who will make you a plan, the neighbor who will bring lemon loaf. I tell them to take small steps every day because small steps add up. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the parody of Kevin's voice. I still think about the taste of life before the rupture. But mostly, I think about the next small thing I will do. Water the roses, call Linda, check the safe deposit box, teach another class at the center. The life I have now is deliberate and in many ways warmer. If you have seen signs like mine, if you sense that help is becoming a takeover, tell someone. Save emails. Photograph injuries. Tell your doctor in a way that makes them act. Reach out to an elder law attorney. Keep copies. The things that feel small, notes, timestamps, a meeting in a living room, are often the things that translate a whisper into a legal fact. And if this story reaches someone who needs it, share it. Share it not as a moral spectacle, but as a set of borrowed tools. That is why I speak. So someone somewhere will be able to point at a photocopy or a dated photograph in a folder and say, with authority, this happened. So another person will not have to wonder, in the hush of a house at night, whether anyone will believe them. When I sit back at the table, with my hand resting on the well-worn wood Frank shaped with his own hands, I think about what it means to reclaim your place. It means making small, precise decisions in a world that often prefers the easy story. It means remembering that a broken arm does not define your capacity to act, to plan, or to survive. The arrogance of that old joke, my wife taught her a lesson, is now a marker of the moment I decided to be seen instead of silenced. In that sense, the lesson they thought they gave me became, by another route, the lesson I had to learn, to plan, to document, to endure, and then, finally, to live.